Well, it's a pleasure to see all of you this morning. We're glad to have opportunity on the Lord's Day to be together, and in a few moments, let's do exactly what the Lord wants us to do on His day. And we have the privilege of studying from His Word each Lord's Day, and of course on Wednesday nights, and that's always a pleasure for me, and I hope it is for you also. Profitable pleasure. Not all pleasures are profitable, are they? Not all things profitable or pleasurable, but it's both. Somebody I heard, years ago, I heard Brother Marshall Patton preach on Psalm 122. I think it's 122, isn't it? Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Isn't that 122? Or is it 120? 122, I think. Anyway, he talked about how unity is good and pleasant. Not all things good are pleasant. Not all things pleasant are good. And it's both good and pleasant. And that's exactly right when it comes to our Bible studies together. We'll be in Nehemiah 13 in just a moment. We have a lot to do this morning. Landon has handed out as you'll notice, a revised copy of a little article that I gave out Wednesday night. What I'd like for you to do, if you have that Wednesday night article, throw it away. Tear it up, destroy it, shred it, do whatever. I went back. That was something I wrote Wednesday afternoon, and I thought I had, I just did not feel like it was as good as I wanted it to be, and not that this is great. I just did not feel on some substance of it that it was exactly the way I wanted, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And so I wanted to revise it somewhat, and we'll go over that in a minute. Second thing is we've come to the end of Nehemiah, and I asked Wednesday night if everybody would try to do what we've done on other books, and that is to go back through the book and take from each chapter an idea, principle, application that you thought was helpful to you. And we'll try to do that, and then we've got our reading to do and the summary of the book. So a lot to do this morning. Let's start by the way, Lee made it through her surgery Friday. She still has considerable pain around the surgical site, but she's having to keep some ice on it, But otherwise, the surgery was successful, and we're thankful for that. On our reading this morning, we would be through Numbers 31 through Numbers 36, and today's reading would actually put us in Deuteronomy, but I'm not going to cover that. But let's just kind of fast forward on through the book of Numbers. Numbers is about what, guys? The numbering of the people. A census in the beginning, a census in the end. Census in the beginning was the former generation. The census at the end was the new generation. And that's kind of how it's divided. The first 10 chapters down to verse 10, you have them there at Mount Sinai. In 10 verse 11, really through about chapter 21, has them wandering in the wilderness. They go from Mount Sinai eventually to Kadesh Barnea, send out the spies, that's in chapters 13 and 14, come back with the evil report. So in 14, God says for every day the spies were gone, which were how many? 40, they would do what? Wander in the wilderness. And so really from only really 15 through about 20, you have the wanderings. It's a very short time. And then they come on to the land of Moab, and they're camped there, and that will be where they are even through the book of Deuteronomy. And then in those chapters, we have Balaam and Balak. Thank you, Landon. Balaam and Balak. They had enticed Balaam to curse Israel, but what did he do? He blessed them. And we've come down to chapter 31. There is a nation close by that was an enemy to Israel. Starts with an M, the Midianites. And what happens in chapter 31 of Numbers? What's that? They kill them, yes. The slaughter of the Midianites. So they plunder the things that they had. In chapter 32, we begin to divide up the land. And they divide it up, if you think on my imaginary map, here's the Jordan River, Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea. You have what are called the Transjordanic tribes, the tribes across the Jordan, which were Reuben, Gad, half-tribe of Manasseh. And then on the opposite side, from really where everything seems to be written, you've got the other tribes. And so in chapter 32, what happens? The tribes, the Transjordanic tribes are what? They're settled. That's right. They're settled. And there's a warning. We're giving you this land, but you need to come over and do what? Help us fight. Yes, and if you don't, notice verse 23, if you will not do so, you've sinned against Jehovah, and be sure you're what? Your sin will find you out. Good. All right, in 33, there's a type of a history of their various encampments. And then we also have the death of somebody important in verse 38. Who is it? Aaron. Aaron, it's really kind of a, we might say, a judicial execution here. Notice there's a kind of a formality to it. Aaron the priest went up into Mount Hor at the commandment of Jehovah and died there in the 40th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land in the 5th month. Aaron was 123 years old when he died in Mount Hor. They stripped his high priestly garments from him and readied him to die. It's interesting that we do find a little benchmark passage that shows the difference in the ages of Aaron and Moses. We know how old Moses was when he died, Deuteronomy 34. He was 120. And we don't have but a month or so from the time that this ends until the time Deuteronomy ends. It did take about a month or so for all that happened in Deuteronomy to happen, the 3 speeches Moses gave. And so if he were 123, and just a few months later Moses dies at 120, that means Aaron was roughly 3 years older. And likely, Moses and Aaron's sister was Miriam, and it's likely that she was what? Older or younger than Aaron? Probably older, that's right. And the reason is that she was the one sent to do what when Moses was among the bulrushes? She was watching after. So you'll assume she's older than 3. What's Beckett now? 4. Yeah, you'd assume that you'd give a job to a little bit older than 3 or 4, wouldn't you, Lindsay? So you would assume that would be the age. Miriam, Aaron, and then Moses in that order. Chapter 34, we have the division of the land. And then in chapter 35, there are cities that are called cities of what? Refuge. Back during the premillennial arguments among brethren back in the 1930s, R.H. Bowl and others, this was one of the arguments used, that it was predicted that when the children of Israel would come into the land, that they would be given cities of refuge. And that, in essence, that would indicate that the land had been given, that they had settled it, and so on. And then we find in Joshua, that's exactly what happened. And so that's an argument for actually the fact that God did indeed give Israel the land, and he fulfilled the promise, and there's not something in the future to look forward to. But that's one of the arguments used here in the 35th chapter. How many cities were there altogether for the Levitical 48. How many cities were the cities of refuge? 6. And Sandra, you remember how many? Good. 3 on one side, 3 on the other. So you see an efficiency about that. And the cities of refuge were for people who had done what? That's right. Kill someone accidentally. And yet the avenger, the redeemer, might go out and try to exact vengeance on that person. And so if they went to a city of refuge, which was in reasonable distance, that they would find, what do we call that today? Cities that starts with an S, Landon? Sanctuary cities. Yeah, we call those sanctuary cities today. All right, that's in 35. And then in 36, there are various laws concerning marriage and who the priest could marry and so on. And then it ends with verse 13. These are the commandments and the ordinances which the Lord commanded by Moses unto the children of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan. All right, so that ends our reading of Numbers. You just want to remember the three major divisions, the fact that it's the numbering, the organization of the tribes, and you just see a real symmetry, I think, and purposes that I didn't used to see in reading these books of law. You know, they're redeemed in Exodus and given law, and Leviticus. Well, here's the way to maintain this relation with God, through worship, through holiness. And Numbers, they're organized. And then Deuteronomous law, second law, which was not a second law different from the one given on Sinai, but actually a recapitulation of it with some additional rejoinders as to what they were to do once they came into the land. So we come to Deuteronomy and Moses' speeches. Comment or question, anybody? All right, we have come then down to Nehemiah, the 13th chapter. Richard, where did we, no, you weren't here, were you, on Wednesday? You were not feeling well. What verse did we end up with? Yeah, I think it was around 15, which starts a paragraph that deals with what? Violation of Sabbath law. All right, let me go ahead and turn on our chart. I wanted to, as we got into this, I wanted to look just at a few things chronologically. The dates that are mentioned in Nehemiah, the 20th year of Artaxerxes, which probably was 444, some say 445, but you get the general time frame, that Nehemiah seeks permission to go, and then he goes for 12 years. And that's mentioned in chapter 5, verse 14, that he didn't take any wages, and that's alluded to back here in 13:6. So you have roughly 444 to about 432 that he's doing all of this. The wall is being built probably around the 6th month of the 444 BC. And then they have, after it's finished, the 7th month, the Feast of Tabernacles, as chapter 8 shows. And then in chapter 9, right after that, we have this august assembly, and the people confess their sins through this prayer. In chapter 10, they renew their what? Their covenant. And then 11 through 12:26, what we find are genealogies, people who were there who were contemporary with Nehemiah in chapter 11. And then in 12, he goes all the way back to the time of Ezra, and then catapults over to the time, even with some of the high priests who were likely priests around the time of Alexander the Great. All right, so that we do it there. And we've seen this. I just wanted to remind us that Ezra leads this first wave around 536 BC. The temple is begun in 520. It's finished in 516. And Haggai tells them, you need to go ahead and do what? Finish the temple. Finish the temple. And then he alludes in the 2nd chapter about, but God has in mind a bigger temple. And then Zechariah deals with that. And the large-scale temple, so to speak, which really is another idea of what? The church. And so we have that going on during the time of Ezra. And then we have the story about 484 to 475, 474 of Esther, and how it was through her and Mordecai that what big deal, what big thing we remember about Esther? That it was through her and Mordecai that the Jews were saved from annihilation. Exactly right. So you see the seed promise of Genesis 3:15 continuing like a beautiful thread in a tapestry. Then what we find the second time, and not as many people come, but in Ezra around 458, roughly 20 or so years later, Ezra returns. he already writes what had happened in the first return. He wasn't there, but he comes, and then he convinces them they need to divorce from their wives that they had married that were unscriptural, and other reforms as well. And then where we are now, Nehemiah returns, and he has some of the same problems Ezra had. True or false? Exactly right. And so he returns, rebuilds the wall. And so here's where we've been. The reconstruction of the wall, the restoration of the people, the spiritual reformations in 8 through 13. And we're here in chapter 13. The last chapter, we mentioned this Wednesday night, but some of you weren't here. 5:14 indicates Nehemiah's first term as governor, roughly 444 to 432. 13:6 indicates he was recalled to Artaxerxes, was there for an indefinite time, then returned to Jerusalem. And during his absence, that we're seeing what's going on now, the people fell spiritually. And furthermore, a former enemy, Tobiah, was granted a room in the very temple itself, a kind of a storage room, a large room, where actually substances were to be stored for the use of the priest and others. The contributions for the Levites had lagged. There were violations of the Sabbath. They had come back as there were during the days of Ezra. And as a result of a return to the mixed marriages, and you know what we're talking about when we say mixed marriages. Yeah, Jews were marrying people who were pagans. And as a result of that, the speech of the children was corrupted. They spoke half the language of the Jews and half the language of Ashdod. And so Nehemiah corrects this again, and likely the time is after 432. So it could have been a year and a half, 2 years, 430. And I didn't really emphasize this, guys, the other night. But if you think ahead and you've read Malachi recently, that's our next and our last book of the Old Testament, you know. If you've read it recently, you see a whole lot of things that are happening that Malachi reprimands the Jews for that really we're reading about here in the last chapter of Nehemiah. They were bringing sacrifices. They weren't worshiping idols at this time, but the sacrifices they were bringing were what? Lame, blind, maimed. They were being stingy on their tithing and bringing their things into the storehouses. And God said, if you would do what I say, the windows of heaven would release upon you, and you would be blessed supremely. And so there seems to be, well, they're going back, but they're kind of doing it half-hearted. And so really, Malachi likely was written about the time we're talking about here that Nehemiah is correcting. They're working in concert together. All right, so we looked at the foreigners being expelled. If you would, look at, and I want to call attention to this, briefly to this article. If you'll look at Nehemiah 13, the point is made that the Ammonites and Moabites should not what? They should not be there. And they separated themselves from that. Now that's on that day, you notice 13:1. If you look back at 12:44, that was on that day were men appointed over the chambers. That was the same day that they did what, if you take the earlier part of the chapter? Celebrated the dedication of the wall. Or walls. So you've got the dedication of the walls, the reappointment of these people, the reading more of the law, and they find out, and it looks like this is recorded in anticipation of what's going to happen with Tobiah in just a moment. In 4 through 9, Eliashib, who was a high priest, had been appointed over the various chambers of the house, the storehouses, and he gave a great chamber to whom? Tobiah. And I gave you the article, and as I said a moment ago, if you would, you had the Wednesday night article that's of the same title, except the word high was not in the title there. He was the high priest. Just shred, throw that one away. I was kind of ashamed of some of the, not that there was error, but there were a couple of things that I did want to to mention. If you'll look down on, one might wonder, why was such deference given to Tobiah, an openly hostile enemy of God and his people? And the short answer is family relations, the intermarriages. And I mentioned first, Tobiah had connections to Shechaniah. Tobiah was Shechaniah's son-in-law. He was a son of Arah. He, that is Arah, and his sons or descendants. This is where I felt like I needed to do some changing in the paragraph that I gave you Wednesday night. He and his sons were mentioned among the returnees with Ezra. Therefore, Tobiah's wife's grandfather, and I think I may have put father, but it's probably grandfather or possibly great-grandfather. It would be hard to tell on that. When you read the word son, somebody was a son of, the word son is somewhat ambiguous. It could mean a what? A grandson, a great-grandson. Like, for instance, Matthew 1:1. The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. But there are a lot of people in between. So the word son sometimes can mean one direct generation. Sometimes it can mean several. And so that's why, if you look at the time element, from 536, when they actually return, and this fellow Arah and his sons are mentioned, to the time of 444, you've got, 90 years. And so there's probably more than one or two generations, but still there's a connection. And that's the main thing to remember. Shechaniah was a son of Arah. He and his sons were mentioned among the returnees with Ezra. Therefore, Tobiah's wife's grandfather, possibly great-grandfather, went back to the beginning of the return, obviously a perceived leader among the Jews. He was willing to give up things to go back from, Babylon to Jerusalem. They had houses, they married and so on. However, Arah's good heritage through his son Shechaniah was short-circuited by his daughter, who was not too concerned about marrying the Ammonite Tobiah, a clear violation of Deuteronomy 7. Second, Tobiah's son Jehohanan had married a daughter of Meshullam, and Meshullam had worked on the wall under Nehemiah. Therefore, through marriages prohibited by the Mosaic law, both on the part of his wife, that is Tobiah's wife, as well as his daughter-in-law, Tobiah had close family connections among leaders, or at least those considered leaders from the past. And then when you think about the high priest Eliashib, I mentioned here, to his credit, he and his brethren had helped Nehemiah in rebuilding the wall in chapter 3, verse 1. However, he had a grandson who had married a daughter of Sanballat. Well, that brings us back Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, arch enemies of Israel. How in the world would you even let your daughter or son get close to one of them, Therefore, within the ranks of these Jewish leaders, among the returnees, there were unscriptural or unlawful marital relations between Tobiah's family and Israel, and between Eliashib the high priest and Tobiah's pagan friend Sanballat. And can't you hear some say, our dear Tobiah and Sanballat just like family? I hear people like, oh, they're just so close. We're just so close to them. And so it seems from what is stated in chapter 6, primarily 18 and 19, and what's stated here at the end of chapter 13. Look at 13, verse 28. One of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, so that would be a grandson of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat, the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me. So you have Eliashib allows a grandson to marry a daughter of Sanballat. So that's all a problem. On the second page here, I make the point, and I did this on, it's somewhat reworded, but that first paragraph on page 2, all of it indicates powerful and evil influences or influence that marriages to ungodly people can have over families, even good families who have been taught God's word. Nehemiah records the evil consequences that came from these mixed marriages, which fulfilled to the T what God earlier warned against in Deuteronomy 7. There's a tendency to compromise, defend, protect, condone, overlook, and even extol the most vile and hostile people toward the true religion and faithful disciples for the sake of keeping peace in families. And 1 Corinthians 15:33 applies here. Evil companionships corrupt good morals. I mentioned Ruth, but the thing about Ruth is she did what relative to the religion of God? Exactly. She would have been what we would call a proselyte. And so proselytes were welcomed if they would, accept. You think about Boaz married Ruth. Ruth was a what? A Moabitess. And the same thing I was saying there. They're powerful lessons. And I mentioned an example of a family I'm aware of who had a son that needed to be withdrawn from. His parents, grandparents were part of the congregation. The men decided because he was just a rebel against the Lord, he needed to be withdrawn from, and they did. And it ended up the parents and grandparents left. And I made the point in the next paragraph that two passages in Deuteronomy indicate that if somebody, one passage indicates if somebody entices you to be an idolater with them, you are to take the lead in their execution. And if you have a son who's stubborn and rebellious, the mother and father are to bring accusations to the elders of Israel, and they'd take him and stone him to death. Put away evil in Israel is the idea. And so that shows the family was responsible for leading in disciplinary actions. The lessons, I think, yes, sir.
I was going to say it's no different now.
Right.
I know right in Birmingham of a man who participated in the church at Birmingham
Yeah.
mess that they got going, and now he's serving as an elder in what's supposed to be
A faithful group, a conservative group.
congregation.
Yeah.
And when people's children get involved, and you all know a famous gospel preacher and teacher, when his son became involved in an adulterous marriage, he started writing articles.
And-
How it didn't apply what happened before he became a Christian.
Yes.
And it's because doing the right thing sometimes is hard.
It's hard.
For our personal circumstances.
Exactly, Brother Gene. Good.
People are not willing to do that, and they're looking for an escape mechanism, and there's always somebody over here that'll take anybody over anything.
Exactly. I have observed in a number of years that if you want to find justification for something and find it among the preachers, I've restudied the issue, yeah. You can find some preacher somewhere who will justify whatever you want. If it's social drinking, you can find that. If it's divorce, no fornication occurred, you can find that. I was talking to somebody the other day about a case here in Birmingham that I was real familiar with where a fellow committed adultery on his wife early in their marriage. He was divorced for that reason. And then a couple years later, he wanted to remarry. And somebody said, well, he can. And a fellow who was a friend of mine, a preacher, he said, I thought he was divorced for fornication. And he said, he was, and that's why he can remarry. And I thought, brother. And they had an off-the-wall view on 1 Corinthians 7. He that is married seek not to be loosed, and he that is loosed seek not a wife. And they said, well, see, the divorce loosed one from the other, therefore. I said, you're completely forgetting about Matthew 19:9. That has something to do. But anyway, you'll find people everywhere that can justify what you want to do. And Brother Gene is exactly right on that. When it gets to be family ties, children involved, grandchildren involved, brother, sister, or especially a wife or husband, it makes people almost look through rose-colored glasses, and they can't see straight. I mentioned in the valuable lessons, I think, the need for Christians to marry faithful Christians. Here you have the strongest of physical ties in marriage. And then the offspring of marriages would be the children, the next strongest ties. And when they're not what they ought to be, there's that push to try to condone or compromise. And that's why we need all the help we can have to go to heaven. We don't need discouragement or harassment, ridicule to try to do right. Second, when a family member turns from the Lord rather than ignore it, the family should lead in warning and encouraging him or her to return and withdrawal if necessary. And those passages would teach that. There should never be reluctance in the matter of spiritual or church discipline when the need arises. It's for the sinner's good. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 5 that when you assemble yourselves together to deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. You remember all those passages about the warnings of fathers and mothers to chasten the children while they're betimes or while you have time? And if you don't, you're actually looking at the child as if you don't what? You don't pay attention. You don't love him. Yeah, that's right. And I think another thing, and this is true, I didn't mention this in the note. Nehemiah gives a former king as a fine example of how pagan women can lead you astray. Who is it? Solomon. And so never think, this is number 3, never think this is not going to bother me. I'm stronger. I'm going to win him or her to the Lord. Make sure that happens first. We can easily overestimate our own spiritual strength, and Paul warns against it. These Jewish returnees had sacrificed to come back to Jerusalem. They renewed their covenant with God publicly. However, they sinned in these matters. Also, it was very shortly after, not long after they had made their covenant, that they did the very thing they promised not to do. So it is possible, and we ought not to be deceived. You look like you wanted to say something there.
I was thinking about a family that I've known since I was early teen that were led away by a son who wanted to be noticed.
Yeah.
From the day he could speak,
Yeah.
he wanted to be noticed. And he mocks the Lord's church.
Yes.
Articles he writes.
Yeah.
And is led away a
Oh.
huge section of that family.
Yeah. That it.
In the area. Because our boy is special.
Yeah.
Our dog.
And it,
Al Fitmore said something here one time about proms and dancing and cheerleading and that kind of stuff. And he says, I've been a football coach, 40 years. And he said, when you look at the fathers' faces and the little girls out there doing their
doing their.
hoops and jumps and all that stuff and not modestly dressed, he says that you can tell by the expression on the father's face that they know
Better.
better.
Yes.
And they would wish it different, but the mothers push that
The mothers push it, the publicity,
Yes.
the notoriety, all of those things that has so much weight. You're exactly right, Brother Gene. Yes, sir, Tommy.
I know of a man that goes to Hoover Church of Christ who's been living in adultery for 30-something years. And it's like you say, you can find somebody that'll take you in
Yes.
if you look hard enough.
Yes, that's right. You look far enough, hard enough, you'll find somebody. Yeah, that's exactly right. The last point I did not have, the number 4, I did not have that in our thing I gave Wednesday night. Who will be a modern day Nehemiah? With God's help, Nehemiah led them to rebuild the walls in 52 days, which they had had a century to do, but had not. He led even with external and internal enemies, external being Tobiah, Sanballat, Geshem, and then they in turn worked basically internally through their families. And their lies, their attempts to deceive the very ones with whom Nehemiah worked. He knew his cause was right, that it was commanded by God. He knew God was with him. He relied on God in his providence in his frequent prayers, as his frequent prayers indicate. Without his leadership and that of Ezra, it's doubtful the Jewish religion, the priesthood, the pure genealogy, with all it meant to the coming of Christ, could survive. May God use us today to teach, preach, to live faithfully, refuse to compromise in any way with Satan's minions on any modern day plane of Ono. All right. You know who profited most from this? Me. But I wanted to put all that together for my sake. And I thought, well, if it helps somebody else, that'll be good too. All right. Let's see what we can cover in Nehemiah 13. And I mentioned, again, we were going to try to see what we could do with the chapter contents, a point. We'll see how we go. All right, in verse 15 through 22, we have problems over, you've already mentioned it, what? The Sabbath. And in 15 through 16, there is the observation that he has, and then in 17 and 18, he argues with them. And then in 19 through 22, he gets into action, and he puts people at the gate and challenges those who are, I can just see, here's the gate, it's Friday afternoon about 6:05, and the gates have been closed, and these fellas I can just see them, they got their hands on their hips, they're just waiting. Oh, I'll be so glad when this Sabbath day's over so we can get on. In fact, can't we just go in now and, no respect for what the Sabbath is all about. Let's read these passages, 15 and 16. Kirsten, if you would, please, 15 and 16. All right, thank you. It's interesting he mentions the men of Tyre. Everybody remembers where Tyre was located. It was on the what? On the coast. So they had obviously access to a lot of fishing, and Tyre was known for their commerce because of their location. And so you've got a heavy, and it's kind of like people from Atlanta come to Birmingham to sell various things, and representatives come. Here's a big city, it's very commercial. And so they're coming over, and they're leading in this effort to basically break the Sabbath. Michelle, you can feel like reading for us? 17 and 18, please, those next two verses. Yeah, thank you. All right, I contended or rebuked, reprimanded these nobles. The nobles are what? They're not the common people. They're the what? They're the leaders. You ought to know better than to do this. What evil thing are you doing? And there's a great word, and it's the complete opposite if you look down in verse 22. Just glance down. I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and that they should come and keep the gates to do what the Sabbath day? To sanctify. What's the word used at the end of verse 17 that's just the opposite? Profane. And so here what they were doing with the people from Tyre and commerce, just, another day as usual on the Sabbath, they were profanation. Reducing that which is sacred and holy to that which is common is the idea behind there's a Latin phrase, our English word profane, profanus, and I believe it means, I didn't look this up, but if memory serves me correctly, it means to trample the court. Here's a picture of courtyard outside the temple, and you're just trampling it as if there's nothing sacred about it whatsoever. You're disregarding that which is holy. And that's what they were doing. So then in verse 18, did not your fathers thus, that is, didn't our ancestors do the same thing? And didn't we go into captivity because of this? Don't you remember all this? You remember Jeremiah 17, I've got a note to myself, Jeremiah 17, 19 through 27, the better part of a chapter. is relegated to the violations of the Sabbath, and how God, that's one reason, not the only, but it was one reason God was taking them into captivity. Violation of the Sabbath law. And so he says, you bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And they had done that. If you'll notice, keep your finger there, turn back just a page or so to chapter 10. Remember, 10 is the covenant, the renewal of the covenant. Look at verse 31. What does it say there? Just summarize for me. 10:31. Yes. Now the relation of that verse in that context, chapter 10 is where they do what? Renew their what? Their covenant. And just a very, if this is 444, and then you were probably talking 430 by the time of chapter 13, they just completely, 12, 13 years, it's gone. And so we go back to chapter 13, and he says, look, our fathers did all this stuff, and we were carried into captivity because of this. You need to stop that. So, in 19 through 22, he enforces it. He gets a little stronger. Sister Sandra, if you would read 19 through 22 for us. All right, thank you. So, about the time it was getting late afternoon before the Sabbath for the Jews began on what we would call a what? No, not Saturday. Friday evening. Yeah, about the going down of the sun Friday evening. And it would last until the going down of the sun on a Saturday evening, the seventh day of the week. And so here, as it began to get dark, roughly, we'd say 5:45 or so, he commanded that what be done? Gates be shut. And he set special servants that no burden be brought in. Don't tempt the people. We're just going to shut the gates like they ought to be shut and not do that. Well, he had pressure from outside sources, literally outside sources. What's happening outside? Verse 20. They're camping out. They're waiting. And obviously they could shout to the people, when's that old Nehemiah going to get with it? When's he going to turn over? We live in a progressive day. This Sabbath stuff, that's in the past. We ought to be able to sell our wares every Sabbath day, and no big deal. And can't you imagine some of the arguments they could use? Oh, look, if you sell your wares to these people, they can in turn turn around and use what they have obtained and give it to the Lord. It's like the fellow said, if you won $1 million on a lottery, but you gave it to the church, would that be okay? Anyway, you look like you were going to say something again.
One thing we need to think of, they took a tenth of the people and put them in Jerusalem to raise
Yes.
the population, to get the city functioning again.
Yes.
They had to have laws, they had to have somebody leading in the city, and they certainly wanted economic activity.
Yes.
So the pressure is on them. The
Yes.
people there, I ended up with like 20,000 people in there.
Yes.
And that's not very many people for a huge city like Jerusalem.
Right.
So they were under economic pressure.
Yes.
And
Let's,
before we go.
yeah, exactly. Let's get this going, and maybe he'll forget about it.
Come into economic pressure.
Yes. And he takes the leadership and doesn't give in to that. I couldn't help but think in restudying about Chick-fil-A, that they have maintained the status, on not to give the young people who work there opportunities to worship and so on. And you think, well, McDonald's and Burger King and some of the others, Wendy's, don't do that. But you know what? Every time I pass by Chick-fil-A, there's a line running. I don't think they're hurting too badly. And I was thinking about something else. The fact is, when people, for us, it's not the Sabbath. But the first day of the week, according to Revelation 1, verse 10, I was in the Spirit on the whose day? On the Lord's day, the day that belongs to the Lord. And while we don't have some of the specifics, obviously, of the old law, not to do various things, the spirit of the day belonging to the Lord ought to govern some things that we try to do. I got in a discussion one time. I know our time's gone. Let me finish with this. Got in a discussion. A fellow said, well, I think I can wash my car and cut my grass, do everything else, as long as I make it to services. And I told him, I said, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about that, does it? But it does say it's the Lord's day. It belongs particularly to the Lord. If we could not use this day, or we do not use this day to do things particularly that pertain to the Lord and His work, such as maybe visit somebody who needs visiting, or call on somebody, or study a little more, read a little more. If we don't do it on that day, and then we're busy every other day of the week, when do we do it? And it's just something to consider, that we allow time for the Lord and His work. You look like you wanted to say something.
I'm reading an article the other day about this 7-day Adventist school that advanced to the playoffs.
Yeah.
And their
Yes.
championship game is going to be on Saturday.
Yes. And they,
I said, can we change it? And they said, no. We won't play it.
they forfeited it. Yes.
Stuck there,
They stuck to the guns on that.
At least they were faithful enough to do what they
At least they were faithful to their own convictions, regardless of how wrong or right they were. Okay, we're going to have to stop. Lord willing, we'll finish up with this last part on Wednesday and go through our chapters and the points made there. Okay, thank you for all